أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين المبعوث رحمة للعالمين شفيع المذنبين وحبيب قلوب الصادقين سيدنا ومولانا أبي القاسم محمد
اللهم صل على محمد
وعلى أهل بيته الأطيبين الأطهرين الهداة المهديين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم إلى قيام يوم الدين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي أما بعد. Dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I know that the day after one of the nights of Laylatul Qadr is often not a high point for people's energy level and enthusiasm. And I will inshallah try to keep that in mind, and we'll keep our discussion brief inshallah. I will keep my remarks brief, and after that we may have an opportunity for some questions and answers. But we'll keep that inshallah in view of the fact that we are both recuperating inshallah from a night of worship and also preparing for another one to come. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So if you recall, before the majalis for the martyrdom of Amir al-Mu'mineen and Ibn Abi Talib alayhi salatu wassalam, we have been discussing ways of trying to understand Islam and develop a little bit of a more intimate connection with the spirituality of Islam. That there are many different types of challenges that people face in their faith. And it is our understanding of Islam, it is our level of familiarity in Islam that will determine whether our process of learning or increasing will be a stable one or will be an unstable one. Just to give an example from nutrition. If you live your life determining your diet and your nutrition based on every newest study that comes out, then you probably will not have a lot of stability in your life. You'll find a study that caffeine is good for you and it gives you energy and helps your memory and prevents cancer and makes you immortal. And so then you'll develop a habit of drinking coffee for a few months, and all of a sudden you'll find out that coffee kills you. And then you'll have to kick the habit until you find out something else. And that's not just with nutrition, but with lifestyle issues in general. I remember there was a time when they said that willpower is a finite resource. And so don't struggle with small decisions, because if you decide where to have breakfast and what to wear, and you're making a few decisions, even if they're small decisions in the morning, then by the time you get to mid-morning or afternoon, you will have used up the reservoir of your decision-making, and all of a sudden, you're more likely to make bad decisions or make impulsive decisions. And I'm sure people may have changed their routine based on that study, and then a few months later, there was another study that was released that may or may not be the case. Now, in some cases, it's bad journalism, and the actual study may not really have been so unstable, but it might be conveyed to a non-expert or a non-specialist in a bad way. But in many cases, it's the nature of the field, that scientific progress, that scholarly progress, that there is a pull in one direction and a pull in another direction. It's not advisable for a person to ignore those studies. It's not advisable for us to learn, study, and be completely oblivious to the field of psychology. It's not advisable for us to make decisions about our exercise, about our diet, and have no concern about what academic research says about the effects of certain foods. But then if you look at just many of us who are adults, there was a time when egg yolks were poison, and now egg yolk may actually be good. There was a time when the carbohydrates in potatoes were poison, and now it might actually be the case that that is good. Fat was considered to be a harbinger of death, and now fat might actually be useful in preventing certain kinds of illnesses. So that is the nature of human scholarship and human study. And that's something that in the West, we have a particular sensitivity to, of looking at new studies and then basing our major life decisions on those studies. Sometimes collective wisdom, received wisdom, old wives' tales are not as enthusiastically received. We think of them as being perhaps backwards, we think of them as being perhaps less developed and less sophisticated, and so we might ignore them. And regardless of whether that's good or bad, that's a separate discussion as to whether that's a good way to make decisions for health, for our economic future, and so on and so forth. But in religion, I have seen that play out time and time again. A person wants to get to know Islam better. And so they think the best way to do that is to find cutting-edge research on Islamic theology or Islamic history. They want to connect to the Quran, and so they find out what are scholars saying about the history of the Quranic text and the collection and the authenticity of the Quranic text, and all of a sudden there is a new manuscript discovered in England, or its old manuscript is dated differently, and people's idea of, wait a minute, what does Islam mean? What does the Quran mean? What is Shiaism? It changes entirely. And again, just like I gave with the example of nutrition, that's not a bad thing, to have a view towards that scholarship. But as a basis for deciding whether or not to believe in the Quran, to be dependent on every new artifact that is unearthed, and then the back and forth of it being dated and authenticated and contextualized is probably not a good way to decide whether to or not to believe something or have faith in something. And it was in this context that, as we discussed in the previous nights, we should not say that therefore the intellectual component is not important. It is very important for us to be aware of and to be curious about those scholarly fields. But the basis of our faith is something else. The basis of our faith is our fitrah. It is our soul and the needs and the purpose that we find within life. And if that is the basis of our faith and our commitment to our faith, then that scholarship, as it comes in, it will have a complementary role, a supplementary role. It will complete the picture, deepen the picture, but it will allow us to have certain areas of uncertainty or ambiguity and not all of a sudden lose faith. What I'm saying is, in other words, that there are two challenges that people face that I think are particularly hard felt because of either Western society or because of the culture that we have in today's world, and that might even infect many of us within Muslim societies and in Muslim countries. One is to view Islam as entirely or primarily an intellectual exercise. To think or to know something on an intellectual level. Not to say Islam is not relevant to our rationality and our thinking and our intellect. It is. But to say that what makes us Muslim is not because we have studied the philosophical proofs of God and His existence, and we find the cosmological arguments convincing, or we find the teleological arguments convincing. That is not why most people are Muslim. Most people probably cannot remember what the details of those arguments are. And even if they find them convincing, if somebody who is a philosopher comes and pokes holes, they might not be able to realize what the answer to those objections or those questions might be. That doesn't mean their faith is less meaningful or their faith is less justified. It simply means that their faith is not rooted primarily or entirely in a philosophical proof. And when we study Tawheed and when we study Islam, that is a weakness. If the discussion of God's existence I can't compete with a file that's showing a Windows directory. So either that's going to have to be lost, or I'm going to have to compete. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So the basis of our identification with Islam is something that is deeper and more profound and more meaningful than a philosophical proof. If we have faith, then that intellectual argument can help clarify things for us. It can help us understand things in a more comprehensive way. It can help us communicate with others better. So one issue that we have is to view Islam primarily or entirely through an intellectual lens. And I think that is a danger, a potential danger to our faith. The other is to view Islam primarily through an individual lens. That your faith is something that concerns you and belongs to you. It's a private affair, it's an individual affair, it's a moral affair. And both of those counts, I think that something is missing. I remember when I was a kid, not only did I hear people, but I would also often be one of those critics who would go to a Muharram program, and generally a Muharram program, the traditional Indian, Pakistani majlis that I grew up with, would have poetry. The poetry would seem like it was going on for several hours. It would be maybe 10 minutes. And then there would be a speech. The speech would have an Arabic component and then a verse of Quran, and then maybe some praise of Ahlul Bayt alayhimu salatu wassalam. And now Iranians may not be able to relate with this as well, because generally there is some academic component in most Iranian speeches, but it would generally be a little bit of poetry in prose. And then there would be a musiba and a mention of the martyrdom of Imam Hassan, and then there would be poetry in poetry with a noha and a program at the end. And so you'd be there for an hour and a half, and you'd sometimes learn maybe 3 things, 4 things, 2 things. And there would be a complaint that many of us would have, myself included, that I went to a majlis and I did not learn much. And again, that's not an unjustified criticism. The content of a program that brings Muslims together is something that should give us food for thought. It should challenge us in some way. But the solution that we have in some communities now is let's skip the majlis and have a lecture. Let's shorten the poetry and maybe shorten the musiba and have a lecture, structured, learn. And when that happens, you have, and you might have seen this in some communities, I don't know if Houston, I haven't heard of it in Houston, but it might exist here too. What happens is that when you have a lecture for Muharram, then young and old don't come together. Families with kids and single professionals don't come together because they don't want to learn about the same things. Some people are interested in how to raise good kids. And other people have already raised their kids and raised their grandkids, and they don't want to hear about it again. They're interested in other things. There's people who are single, there's people who are married, there's people who are at one stage of life or another stage of life. And so the community begins to splinter. Because a workshop that appeals to you, a lecture that appeals to you, is not something that appeals to everybody. The idea that this is a time for us to signify our communal identity is lost, and it becomes, well, you're interested in calligraphy, right? You should learn calligraphy. You're interested in computer programming, you should learn computer programming. We don't yet have majalis on calligraphy and majalis on computer programming, but the idea that it should be what you want to learn and what religious message you consider to be important is moving in that direction, that it will be sort of a project that is targeted towards the individual. What you consider to be spiritually important, but still something that is for the individual. And it also means that then the participatory and that spiritual aspect will become secondary. Historical fact will become much more of a concern. You've also probably seen this, where you have annotated majalis. That, well, was Imam Ali alayhi salam martyred in the mihrab, or was it when he was walking into the masjid? What does one history say and another history say? Was it in nafilat al-fajr, or was it in Fajr prayer itself? Was Imam Hassan 40 yards from the masjid, or was he in his home, or was he with Amirul Mu'mineen? There are different reports, and therefore we can't say anything. Right? And so now you say Shaheed of Mihrab, and all of a sudden you have to doubt and say Shaheed of Mihrab or Masjid, or the way in the middle, or on the way to the Masjid. And when the history becomes primary, then you have to be precise. My point is simply this, to summarize, that the history is important, and it has a place. We shouldn't say that it's all irrelevant and we can fudge it in poetic license and pretend that we can make it up. But Muharram primarily is not about learning facts. It's not about being able to write an annotated, well footnoted, and researched chronology of the martyrdom of a particular imam. If we think it is, then maybe just as we have real critiques of our community programs, which are fair, and I don't want to deny them, maybe we should also critique our own assumptions and our own priorities. Why is it that we are looking for something like this? If we are starved for intellectual content, then we should have intellectual content in our communities. It doesn't mean that the 12 days of Muharram or a majlis for Ahlul Bayt needs to be that intellectual content. It doesn't mean that automatically. I'm not saying it shouldn't have intellectual content, but if there are critiques that we have, challenges that we face, we should also be introspective and see what is it about us as individuals and our culture that might be out of kilter? Or what is it about our real needs, that are valid needs, that is not being met, that we are trying to fulfill it or meet it in one venue that might not be the most appropriate for it? If you look at the majalis that existed in the time of Ahlul Bayt alayhimu salatu wassalam, Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
That is my cue to look at the clock, and inshallah I will end within just a few more minutes. If you look at the majalis that existed in the time of Ahlul Bayt alayhimu salatu wassalam, it was almost entirely poetry. And it was a practice of the imams that when a poet would come and say that I have composed verse not seeking profit as used to exist in the time of the imams, but just for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the imams would often say, wait, don't compose that poetry. The imams would say that my wives, or we won't use the word wives right now, that might be controversial, that the women folk and the children and the family members and young and old come, and they will sit in the next room and we will sit here, and we will have a joint gathering and listen to the poetry and participate. And the imams would say that if you are affected by the verse in praise or commemoration of the mourning of Ahlul Bayt, then don't mourn silently. Because it's not you mourning. It is you affirming that that grief and that mourning is an identity and a point of pride and a means of building a community and an identity. And so if I am affected and I just weep silently, I am doing an injustice. Because it is meant to be proclaimed. It is meant to be affirmed as a group. So we see that there is a different value system that is operating. Now, does that mean that we should have purely poetic, non-scholarly, non-academic majalis in Muharram? Absolutely not. What I'm saying is that we should examine what are some of the areas that we might have criticisms of, and as we continue to try to improve and critique and reform our practices and our communities, let's also be introspective and self-critical and see where perhaps some of our expectations may mean that we are losing sight of something that is important. In summary, the basis of our faith is that connection, which is rooted in a way of being in a direction that we want our soul and our existence to take. Connection that we want to have to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and a connection to Allah that is affirmed and facilitated by a connection to the Prophet and Ahlul Bayt. And so that relationship to God and the relationship that we have to the Prophet and Ahlul Bayt, they have a single term that is used in our ahadith to refer to all of them, which is wilayah. Wilayah does not mean our relationship to the Imam. Wilayah is our relationship to the Prophet. And it is our relationship to the Imam. And it is also our relationship to Allah. Allah is our Mawla. That was the answer that was given to Abu Sufyan by the Prophet in the Battle of Uhud. When Abu Sufyan wanted to brag to the Muslims that, look, we brought our idol, which is what we rally around, and we have Al-Lat, and we have Al-Uzza, and you do not have an Uzza, an idol. And the Prophet says, we have Allah, who is our Mawla. And you have no Mawla, you have no Wilayah. So Wilayah is a term that combines Tawheed and Nubuwah and Imamat, because it is a connection and a way of being. And we want to affirm that connection and that way of being on an ethical and a moral level, first and foremost. And that is what our commemoration of the lives of Ahlul Bayt ﷺ should be about. Our understanding of the doctrine of Islam, our understanding of the theology of Islam and some of the details, that is something that is very important. It should come and it should complement, complete, supplement that basis. But it should not supplant that basis. When it supplants it, and you think that when I study about Islam as an intellectual project, then I am studying Islam, that is a mistake. Studying about Islam is good, but it is not studying Islam. Studying Islam, knowing Islam, is about learning and practicing and identifying and deciding all together. And that is, inshallah, something that it is our challenge as a Muslim community in America to begin to think about and to begin to affirm. And we do need to change some of our programs, the structure of those programs, the content of those programs, religious programs in general, not just in Muharram and days of martyrdom, but in general. But as we make that struggle, as we decide what venues we want to take our families to, what venues we want to take ourselves to, let us remember that unlike what we might suspect, it is not just about learning, it is not just about the environment, it is not just about what is good for me or what is good for my family, but it is about connecting to and building something for an ummah and for a community. And with that spirit, I think, inshallah, we will be able to improve upon some of those cultural artifacts we have that we don't use well, without falling prey to some of the weaknesses that we find in the society around us, which, in spite of all our weaknesses in the Muslim community, we are still protected from and safe from. And with that, I will conclude my remarks for today. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I kept my end of the bargain to be brief, I think. But that salawat was a lot more fatigue than I would have expected. Tomorrow I'll show up and not give a speech, which might be a good thing. But if you would like to affirm that you are still awake, then please recite the salawat that is worthy of the gathering.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
So would you like to have some questions, or if people are tired, we can conclude.
You ask once, I'll give you $1.
I think you're going to have to raise the stakes. Maybe, sure.
Actually, it's more a question from last night. I guess to also connect to tonight's speech. So last night you were talking about the Balaya, and that's the component that will keep us practicing and continuing that way. But it was a question in my mind today that, like, we don't see, I mean, of course we see a lot of people that are in that way, and also we also see people like Zuhair that are not in that way, but then they connect and they go. So what is the component of that Walaya? So there are some people that they were in Muharram Majalis like years ago, but then they go in another ways. I mean, I think is it like just going to this Majlis, or
What is it that keeps the connection alive?
Right.
I mean, I don't know if we can Repeat the
Before you
question.
answer, if you can just briefly repeat the question.
But that would require me to have understood the question. I think what I understood from the question, right, is what is it that allows that connection to be kept alive, and what are the factors that don't? I don't think that we can say that there is one factor that can preserve a connection for sure. But what I do think is, and this is what I was trying to say yesterday as well, that sometimes we think that, for example, our practice of fiqh is an insurance policy against losing faith, or knowing our doctrine or our aqidah is an insurance policy against losing the faith. But what I think, in light of the teachings of Ahlul Bayt and in light of the teachings of the Quran, is the most important factor is an ethical way of being. That's going to ensure that I will be able to weather storms, because I will learn new things. In practice, Allah knows that we are going to sin. That is the nature of our nafs, that it will tempt us, and we might sometimes succumb to temptation. So our practice will have better days and worse days. Our doctrine will be challenged in different ways. The insurance policy that we can most rely on is to try to have a humble and a receptive and an honest way of being. And that's why I recited the verse of the Quran, that the Quran says, praising Christians, certain Christians, that وَلَتَجِدَنَّ أَقْرَبَهُمْ مَوَدَّةً لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا الَّذِينَ قَالُوا إِنَّا نَصَارَى. The Quran says that out of all of the non-Muslims, those who are going to be closest to the Muslims in love, and elsewhere the Quran says that when they hear the verses of the Quran, they fall onto their chins in prostration and weeping. What would allow a person who is not Muslim to be receptive to the Quran, as the Quran itself says? They might accept Islam, they might have an admiration for Muslims. The Quran says, ذَلِكَ بِأَنَّ مِنْهُمْ قِسِّيسِينَ وَرُهْبَانًا وَأَنَّهُمْ لَا يَسْتَكْبِرُونَ. It goes to akhlaq. It doesn't say that because the Christian's doctrine is close to Muslims, therefore they are going to be sympathetic to Muslims. Like, there might be other religions that have a closer doctrine. It doesn't say that, for example, because Christians' practice is close to Muslims. Jewish practice is a lot closer to Muslim practice in many ways than Christian practice. But they are not أَقْرَبَهُمْ مَوَدَّةً لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا. In fact, the earlier part of the verse says something else entirely. So it is the akhlaq that is going to create that. That's why I said that. But I think that if we believe that an insurance policy for the longevity of our faith is important, then this has to be primary. How I interact with you. Some of us are cynical people, right? And so we'll walk into a masjid for the first time, and the announced time for a program was 8:30 and it starts at 8:45. And without knowing anything about what's going on, we will have a negative thought that will come out. We have a cynical kind of personality. Regardless of how generous we might be and how good our belief is, that is an akhlaqi illness. We have to work on it. And sometimes that is not given sufficient recognition. Question from the sister's side? One question, and then I think we'll conclude.
You mentioned in your youth or in the past that there was a desire to come to Majalis and learn something. And perhaps part of my personal weakness, the learning has oftentimes been a little insufficient because over time I would forget. And so combining learning with doing is a bit of an elixir for success. So I want to ask you what we may as a group consider doing that will change our evening and maybe change our near-term future. And so what that would be, I won't presume to know, but I will say that in conversations in the last few weeks, individuals in these communities, we feel like we're under siege. What's happening in the public domain, the private domain, at work, play, you name it. And so it's all we can do simply to survive and at best maintain. I would argue that you're either improving or you're regressing, but it's, I would say, impossible to actually remain static. And this environment then leads you to regress as opposed to progress. Don't want to make excuses and use the barakah of this evening and also the commemoration of Imam Ali Islam. So if this is an appropriate ask, what is that we could consider if we want to take the next step to getting closer to outcome, getting closer to self-realization? What do we do? What might we consider doing as individuals, and if it fits as a group?
So, what are some specific things that we should do?
Yeah.
Right. Now, you alluded to something, I think, which is an important consideration for us to have. The question is, what are some of the doings that we should have in order to try to develop on that path to greater sense of enlightenment and self-realization? One question is, to what extent should we be sort of proactive, and to what extent should we be somewhat defensive or protective, or maybe passive? I don't want to use a negative term, but should we have sort of a maximalist position or a minimalist position? There was a time in the Sunni and in the Shia world when that maximalist position was, it had some currency, right? Even as recently as the Arab Spring, the solution that many of the protesters had in Egypt, or at least the Muslim Brotherhood had, was an Islam huwa al-hal. Right? Islam is the solution. What is the solution? You have an economy that's basically shot, right? It cannot support itself. And depended on trade, worldwide trade has declined. Depended on tourism, tourism has certainly seen better days in Egypt and in many other places as well. What are you going to do? You can have 1 million people out in Cairo and say al-Islam huwa al-hal. That's not going to be able to solve a problem. And the same thing, I think, in the Shia world, maybe in Houston more so than other cities, from what I can tell. There's sometimes a sense of fatigue that we've had some big schemes and some, very maximalist positions, and maybe it doesn't quite work that easily, and we haven't got everything figured out, and the rest of the world is ignorant. So what is our balance there? Now, people have different perspectives, ulama have different perspectives, individual Muslims have different perspectives, and I don't presume to give any kind of authoritative answer. But one thing that I think that we do find from the practice of Ahlul Bayt alayhi salatu wassalam is that they start from their circles of immediate influence. So after Karbala, how did Imam Zayn al-Abidin begin rebuilding Shiism? He only had like a handful of followers who knew that he was an Imam. Right? If you look at an average history of Islam, or an average history of Shiism, they say that Imam Ali claimed to be an Imam, Imam Hassan claimed to be an Imam, Imam Hussein claimed to be an Imam, Imam Zayn al-Abidin, we don't know. Imam Baqir claimed to be an Imam, Imam Sadiq claimed to be an Imam. There's a reason why they do that, because Imam Ja'far Sadiq had a public claim and a public following. Imam Zayn al-Abidin did not have a public claim, and he did not have a public following. Did he claim to be an Imam or not? Well, as we believe the Shia, he did have a claim, and he did have followers, Abu Khalid al-Kabuli and Abu Hamza al-Thumani and others, but it was somewhat underground because of the nature of Islam after Karbala. How did he do it? His own household, his dependents. He would buy slaves, and those slaves would become his students, and they would become his apprentices, and then they would become freed, and they would then, in many cases, form the parents or the grandparents of those who were students of Imam Baqir or Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam. So there was a procedure that was adopted by Imam Zayn al-Abidin, that you start from the circles where you can influence people on a deeper level, and you try to build outward from there. Now, what I am not going to do is say that where do we fit on how proactive we can be. Somebody might be a naturally conservative person and say that we're at a very defensive place. Our families, our existing Shia community don't make grandiose claims. Right? We're still in the stage of Imam Zayn al-Abidin. Somebody else might be a little bit more confident and say that, no, we've moved past that, we're now at the stage of Imam Baqir or Imam Ja'far Sadiq, we can do a little bit more, let's do some da'wah, let's do some tabligh, and they have a greater confidence and maybe a more dynamic personality. I don't want to make that determination for anybody else, but I think that is the logic that each of us should be applying, as an individual, as a community, that we want to start from the areas of greatest influence and not broadest influence, so where we have the deepest influence. So as opposed to Imam Zayn al-Abidin, there was the Kaysaniya movement. There was the beginnings of the Abbasid revolution. right, which came to fruition later. I don't want to give a history lesson, but their focus was spread it wide, right? And in many cases, they were somewhat successful. Thousands of people followed them. In the case of the Abbasids, within a generation, they were actually able to overthrow the Umayyad Empire, biggest empire in the world at the time. So that was one model, spread it wide, and there was another model, deepen. That's what I think is the authentic teaching of Ahlul Bayt. Actions that are deep. So strengthening your family, building community centers, making sure that we don't lose Shia members of our community to cynicism, to getting disenchanted by our politics and our problems, and then kind of disconnecting from the community, and so on and so forth. And then how far you think we are along the line of being proactive or not, that is a determination that every person can make with their own experience. You don't have to be an alim, a Islamic scholar, to have an opinion about society. Every one of us is a member of society. Inshallah, with that, we will conclude the session for today, and we'll resume the discussion tomorrow.
One more question if you have time. So we have a hadith that says, الدعاء يرد القضاء.
Yes. وقد أبرم إبراهيم.
So this response or the answer to us, why we are doing dua, and then most of them is not أبرم إبراهيم. Then what is criteria?
الدعاء يرد القضاء وقد أبرم إبراهيم. Dua changes your destiny, even if it's been finalized. That is a hadith, and it is accurate. The basic principle that we have in Islam is that God is not a fashioner, but God is a creator. In the sense that the world exists within God's mind, so to speak. Not that the world exists as a consequence of God and outside of God. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is creating at every instant. There's no such thing as creating and sustaining being separate. So if that is the case, right, it's kind of like, for example, if I push this microphone, right, I might give it a good push, and then my hand is separated and it keeps on moving, right? And at one point, my hand might cease to exist, but that momentum in a vacuum might continue, right? But what about this movement? Can I say that I've set it in motion, but now my hand can cease to exist, and this will exist? No. Because this movement is the movement of my hand. So the creation of Allah is not like this, winding up the clock, but it is that continual creation. This movement is being continually created by me. It's not set in motion by me and then exists independently. So dua basically is connecting to God's continuous motion. It is a connection to what God is doing. And because God's creation is at every moment a decision that is made by God, or a decree that is made by God, dua responds and interacts with that. Now, how is it answered? Sometimes it's answered by God saying, no, not now, or not yet. Sometimes it's a change in quality but not in quantity. Sometimes it's a change in quantity that is visible. Right? So there's many different ways that it's answered. But the basic answer is that it doesn't have to be something that is visible. The nature of creation is such that God is intimately involved in every small and big affair, just like every movement of my body is part of my body and inseparable from my body. And so my movement of my hand is responding to every other being or fiber within my being. If I have a fever, if I have an infection, if I have a state of euphoria, then my whole body is participating in that. All of the creation is participating in God. Dua cannot be but effective because it is part of that relationship that exists within God. Now, how is it answered? How is it not answered is a separate question, but it's not really that important anymore because it's more about being receptive to the fact the material world has a higher level than it is about getting a particular result from God. So that's a little bit of kind of a beginning of an answer. But discussion of why du'as are accepted, why du'as are rejected, what does it mean for a dua to be accepted, that's a separate question. With that, inshallah, we can conclude for today and we'll resume tomorrow, inshallah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد